The qualifications I have for making this video is being abnormal and amassing over 9 biographies about Oscar Wilde. Now, those credentials may seem to color my next statement, but I promise you it is completely objective. People will wax rhapsodic for hours about Dorian Gray if you let them. This is not only true for queer people or English majors or the inevitable overlap, even though I think that all three make up a vast majority of Oscar Wilde fanatics, case in point. But even if you're not queer, even if you're not a reader, chances are you will be seduced by Dorian Gray. The sumptuous dinner parties and elegant gentlemen's clubs, the beautiful silk clothing and sordid opium dens, the green carnation worn in a young man's buttonhole, which seems to denote something seedier. All of these things and more seem tailor-made to our 21st century predilections, amassing great wealth and beauty at a profound cost. That being said, I found that what people seem to unanimously recall best from Dorian Gray is the big overarching relationship dynamics. They will cite their love for the love triangle between Basil, Lord Henry, and Dorian. They will exclaim their dismay and horror at Alan, Dorian Gray's ex-lover, being blackmailed into dissolving Basil's body. They will cite their sympathy and alliance for Sybil Vane for having loved an evil blonde twink. What a good swath of readers will not do is bring up chapter 11, which is not about any of these dynamics whatsoever. Rather, it is an ode to beauty, not male or gay or belonging to any corporeal human form, but rather pertaining to material man-made beauty in most if not all of its modes. The dislike/indifference seems to beget a surface-level explanation. Not only does chapter 11 seem to exemplify Wilde's propensity for purple prose, it is, one can argue, the platonic ideal of 19th century purple prose. But I think beyond the smorgasbord of increasingly literary adjectives, the real reason why chapter 11 so irritates or downright unsettles is because no other chapter provides us in such laborious detail the factor of our own failings in the 21st century. Chapter 11 harkens back to that initial metaphor Wilde espouses in Dorian Gray's preface. The 19th century dislike of realism manifesting as readers being enraged by Caliban seeing his own face in the glass has been co-opted as our own dislike in the 21st century. In our post-COVID, politically and financially tenuous 21st century circumstance, we have developed an excessive adoration for beauty, if not for excess itself. Boston University's Public School of Health released an article in 2022 citing how in the US alone, 34 billion pounds of textiles were dumped without recycling. British environmental organization Green Match released in the same year an article citing that the carbon dioxide waste of just one of the 50 diamond mines currently operating globally was approximately 165,000 metric tons. To put into context, that number is around 19 years worth of Taylor Swift private jet rides all in 1 year. And if you're curious about how much the diamond miners themselves make, in Africa it's estimated that almost 1 million miners get an average of less than $1 a day. Perfumery isn't safe from harmful practices either. Katy Kelleher's nonfiction book The Ugly History of Beautiful Things details how civets are kept in a state of terror to generate the beloved smell. The reason why I bring this up isn't because I have a penchant for Debbie Downing, but rather because all three modes of production, textiles, gemology, perfumery, make up the bulk of Dorian Gray's chapter 11. Our hunger for these ancient modes of beauty, which provides us with tactile, olfactory, and sensory delights, and more significantly, a route of escape from the menagerie of horrors that comprises our global landscape today, has emboldened us to create our own little horrors in turn, in the name of procuring, producing, and preserving such beauty. There's a phrase in Katy Kelleher's The Ugly History of Beautiful Things that caught my eye immediately when first reading it. The fantasy of attainable luxury. I think that so aptly encapsulates the feeling of entitlement that spurs on most people's consumption habits nowadays. But to Oscar Wilde and his contemporaries, attainable luxury meant something else entirely. It wasn't an intrinsically destructive habit that would lead to staggering global wastage. Rather, it was something that people could produce on their own, even if they weren't a part of the bourgeoisie. In 1882, Wilde embarked on his infamous cross-American road trip, where he was tasked with giving a series of lectures on the basis of aestheticism, where Wilde argued, and I quote, "Art is not something that you can take or leave, it is a necessity of human life." He was addressing this to an all-American audience, many of whom lacked the means of the English aristocracy to live excessive lives. But what the middle class of America could do, Wilde argued, was improve upon their own craftsmanship. It's very telling that when Wilde criticizes the art that has been allotted the middle class American, He speaks of machine-made furniture and horrible designs, and the general line of thinking that extravagance is limited to the dead. But as we established, art is a necessity of the living. So what does Wilde recommend to rectify this? Marry handicraftsmen and artistry together. Let that symbiosis occur so that beautiful and durable designs may unfold. Switching gears to textiles, Wilde optimistically predicts that in the future, dress will teem with drapery and abound with joyous color. This prediction seems deliciously ironic in a time where we're facing a recession, a common feature of which is dress getting progressively longer, but otherwise being totally robbed of color, as consumers tend to opt for more office-friendly wear, probably in a desperate attempt to retain their tenuous holds on their jobs. This strikes a chord with Katy Kelleher's The Ugly History of Beautiful Things, where she argues that luxury is about access. It is above and beyond what we need. It is a way to denote social status, to signify to others what part of the hierarchy we belong to. You can easily apply that mode of thinking as to why so many people are purportedly spending their money on luxury items when many people can't afford to pay the rising rent prices. Why Aaron can get away with selling a $20 strawberry encased in plastic. Wilde also had problems with his contemporaries' jewelry production, which he claimed was vulgar and coarse, and this criticism made well before plastic and brass became the primary materials used to create jewelry. So to reiterate, Wilde disapproves of cheap materials, poor production design, lack of diversity in color and texture, and the separation of craftsmanship and art. And moreover, he believes that everyone, regardless of social stratum, deserves good art, that art is in fact a necessity of their lives. In his essay, The Soul of the Man Under Socialism, he claims that to recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting, really driving home the fact that we have not changed significantly as a society since the 19th century, where he argues that in a community like theirs, in 19th century England, property confers social distinction, power, status, and it's small wonder that people overwork themselves to produce more property that they don't even truly need. Property here being interchangeable with material possession. All of these considerations in mind, going back to Dorian Gray's chapter 11, it is telling that we start off on our long, arduous, and purple prosy journey with a sentence. It was the creation of worlds such as these, which were born out of sensory input, that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object or amongst the true object of life. In other words, the world feels more real when it's doled out in beautiful bite-sized pieces. It's one of the only remnants of humanity still afforded to Dorian, who by this point in the novel has made his mystic and abstract deal with the devil to keep his youth and beauty. It seems a matter of course that when all other avenues are exhausted, he can still feel a dopamine rush, however temporal, at the accumulation of beautiful things. It's interesting that Dorian's tastes for gems is the mode of production that may be said never to have left him. Katy Kelleher, quoting Victoria Finlay, states in The Ugly History of Beautiful Things, jewels are often paid for at the point in time where men can least afford them. This is indicative of the diamond-water paradox. Water is ubiquitous, but it can scarcely buy anything. Diamonds have zero practical value, but you can afford many material goods by paying for them with diamonds. But Dorian isn't as enamored with the worth of those stones so much as the intermingling of beauty and horror that they denote. Quoting from the book, he concludes the segment on gems with how exquisite life had once been, how gorgeous in its pomp and decoration. Even to read of the luxury of the dead was wonderful. This sentiment is further expanded upon in the last conclusion of the segment. For these treasures and everything that he collected in his lovely house were to be to him means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape, for a season, from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. And while it's true that, as Katy Kelleher states in The Ugly History of Beautiful Things, that the impulse to buy luxury items can be born of three impulses: showing one's allegiance to the elite class, reinforcing social norms, or simply out of pure aesthetic appeal, it's clear that Dorian's reasoning is born of that last impulse. Historically, only the rich could indulge in the amassment of vast amounts of luxury items. But now that luxury item imitations are so ubiquitous, now that the fantasy of attainable luxury has been arguably fully realized, there is now accordingly a new need to reinforce true luxury items to make up for the vulgarity of their seeming attainability by the lower classes. Hence the egregious pricing at Erewhon, or why McMansions that were made for a fraction of the cost in 2010 are now selling for millions more than the initial wealth spent to create them. The real beauty then in luxury item purchasing is that while the intermingling of beauty and horror is always present, The beauty of the design obscures the horror that an underpaid child laborer made your clothing, your purse, mind the diamonds on your neck and in your ears. While its intention for handicraftsmen and artistry to go hand in hand has been grossly inverted. Now it's a common refrain that a big company, like Target, will steal the design of a small content creator, like fashion brand company. There's absolutely no fidelity anymore from the handicraftsman to the artist. And if a consumer can get their object of desire for cheaper, then the cheap price can oftentimes soothe the herd of the horror being more prominent than the beauty. Oftentimes you'll see people defending their overconsumptive habits by palely echoing Wilde's sentiment in The House Beautiful. The beauty in art should be a God-given right, and also palely echoing Wilde's sentiments in The Soul of the Man under Socialism, that to tell a poor man to thrift is both disgusting and vulgar. It's an exceedingly difficult notion to grapple with, the idea that everyone deserves beauty in art, regardless of social stratum, but that the production of luxury items is relying more and more on exploitative practices. The only modicum of comfort and the only actionable path I've been provided with is from Katy Kelleher's The Ugly History of Beautiful Things. Speaking of the infinity rose modeled after Disney's Beauty and the Beast, Kelleher notes that while these roses can mimic a living thing from afar, they don't pass muster up close. They're like any tactile or olfactory delights. And what's more, they're another piece of plastic among many. In their attempts to create and preserve beauty, the creators of the infinity rose have robbed beauty of all meaning. What is beauty if it can't play off horror? Not the horror of having exploitative practices parent it, but the horror of knowing that eventually this good thing will end, as all things do. Kelleher aligns herself with the beauty of wildflowers instead, unassuming perhaps, but a reminder that one doesn't have to be long-stemmed and red to lead a beautiful life. Beautiful things aren't owed to us, but we owe it to ourselves to find and create beauty, in even the mundane aspects of our lives. But we aren't compelled to find beauty in its most exploitative forms. Turquoise can easily suffice in the place of diamonds, pure cotton in the place of silk. When we attribute a higher meaning to a more exploitative and thus prohibitive form of beauty, all we're doing is reasserting the class gap that the companies who manufacture ostensibly luxury goods tell us that with the purchase of their product, we are closing for ourselves individually. And really, it's just a very silly and ultimately fruitless habit to attribute a higher social, political, and spiritual meaning upon one particular luxury good over another, when you consider that, in the end, all art is quite useless.